The severe drought had already handed down its brutal verdict. Red Willow Bench lay gasping beneath a sky that was white, blazing, and drained of life. Willow Creek. The name itself was now nothing but a cruel irony. Stripped of every last drop, it was now merely a long scar of cracked stone, its final pulse of life having evaporated weeks ago. Across the valley, cornfields stood limp and soulless. Their leaves had twisted into bone-dry tubes that whispered mournfully whenever the deadly wind swept through. Every fence line now seemed to serve only one purpose, dividing one patch of despair from another. Except for one. A single field still carried deep green. The corn stood tall and proud. Pole beans clung to their stakes without a tremor of surrender. Broad pumpkin leaves spread wide, embracing the dark soil that stubbornly refused to die. A crowd of neighbors gathered at the fence in stunned silence. Ironically, just this past spring, they had stood right here and mocked him. Now, not a single one could muster a smirk. Tobias Thornavale kept working, swinging his hoe as if no one were there. Nearby, his wife, Eliza, stood on the cabin porch with her arms crossed, letting her proud silence speak for itself. Not a single prying eye out there could fathom the miracle hiding right beneath the dirt they stood on. 252 unglazed clay jars lay invisible beneath thin, flat stones, painstakingly releasing drops of life like steady, enduring breaths. Above ground, a harvest was singing, and all around them, an entire valley held its breath, receiving an answer it had never dared to dream of. Rewind 6 months. In late March of 1887, while the rest of the valley was still caught up in the illusion of spring, Tobias Thornavale stood at the edge of his field, his gaze piercing into the endless expanse. The snow on the distant peaks had vanished far too hastily. The prairie grass had withered and died before it could even turn green. He walked to Willow Creek and compared the water against a cottonwood branch he had marked the previous spring. The level had fallen almost a hand's breadth. When Eliza wondered aloud if they should delay planting, Tobias just stood there in silence. He stared at the dying stream for a long time before finally speaking. "This creek won't survive past July," he murmured. Eliza looked back at the branch, swallowing the silence. In that moment, the impending, terrifying drought was no longer just a vague fear. It was a death warrant that had already been quietly sealed, forever irreversible. Nearly 4 acres had already been broken by sheer grit and sweat, yet Tobias ruthlessly crossed out almost a quarter of it before a single seed could even touch the dirt. Water, not land, would be the tyrant dictating this harvest's fate. Through gritted teeth, he marked exactly 3 2/5 acres for planting. Corn would form the towering backbone. Pole beans would coil tightly around the stalks. Pumpkins would blanket and shade the soil, and a narrow strip of sorghum would stand on the front lines, bracing against the parching breath of the western wind. Eliza sat beside the seed chest, meticulously logging every sack and handful into a small notebook. Both of them knew exactly what was at stake. Under the homestead law, if this crop failed, the government would permanently strip them of this 160-acre claim. Tobias stared at the map one last time. Surface watering now would be nothing short of sacrificing the crop's lifeblood to the sun and dust. The roots had to absorb every last drop before the merciless prairie could steal it away. Eliza quietly closed her notebook. With their survival and the very dirt beneath their boots riding on this harvest, neither of them could afford a single mistake. 2 years earlier, Tobias had shared a campfire with Matteo Cardenas, a traveling potter who earned his living trading handmade clay goods from settlement to settlement. Before leaving at sunrise, Matteo had picked up an unglazed jar and tapped its rough surface with one finger. "The clay shouldn't trap the water," he had said. "It should persuade it to leave, slowly. Good advice works the same way." He explained that the jars had to be fired hot enough to stay strong, yet never glazed. A sealed surface would hold water inside. A porous wall would feed the roots instead. At the time, Tobias had carried the lesson away like an interesting story from the trail. Now, standing over a field that might not survive the summer, he finally understood it had never been a story. It had been an instruction waiting for the right season. Eliza listened without interrupting. She could not judge the pottery. She trusted the careful way Tobias judged everything else. The following morning, Tobias drove his wagon to Silas Breck's trading post with more questions than certainty. Near the loading yard stood a familiar wagon piled with rough clay jars. Mateo Cardenas recognized him at once. "I kept the ones worth selling," Mateo said, running a hand across the dusty load. The cracked ones stayed behind. There were exactly 252 sound jars. Each carried a narrow neck, a rounded body, and walls fired from river clay mixed with fine sand. Tobias asked if more could be made. Mateo slowly shook his head. "Not before planting. Clay needs time. So does fire." The price came to $37.80, plus the bundle of dried rabbit hides Tobias had trapped through the winter. Coin after coin disappeared onto the counter until his pockets lay empty. Silas watched without speaking. He had seen men spend everything on horses, plows, and seed, never on clay. Before Tobias climbed onto the wagon, Mateo rested one hand on a jar. "The jars only help a man who keeps filling them." Tobias nodded once. As the wagon rolled home beneath the spring sky, he could not tell whether he had just purchased a harvest or the valley's next joke. News traveled across Red Willow Bench long before Tobias reached home. Someone at Silas Breck's trading post mentioned the wagon. Someone else counted the jars. By sunset, nearly everyone knew that Tobias Thornevale had traded away almost every dollar he owned for clay. Ephraim Kells, an older grain farmer who trusted only methods that had survived his lifetime, laughed first. Planning to raise corn inside pottery? He called across the road. Or opening a graveyard for broken jars? Several men laughed with him. The joke spread faster than the wagon itself. Not everyone joined in. Nora Vance, a widowed homesteader raising 2 children, walked slowly around the stacked jars after Tobias reached his barn. She studied their rough surfaces before turning to Eliza. "Does he truly believe this will work?" Eliza glanced toward Tobias as he carefully unloaded another pair without looking up. "He doesn't do things because he hopes," she answered quietly. "He does them because he has reasons." Nora nodded but left unconvinced. Later, another neighbor asked Tobias the same question everyone else seemed eager to ask. "What are they for?" Tobias lifted another jar from the wagon and answered without stopping his work. "They have a use, nothing more." Behind him, another burst of laughter drifted across the yard. Eliza heard every word, yet she simply picked up the next jar and walked beside her husband toward the barn. That night, Tobias and Eliza closed the barn doors against the prairie wind. The laughter stayed outside. Inside, only the lantern and the smell of fresh clay remained. They counted the jars twice. Tobias arranged them into 12 groups of 21, leaving narrow aisles between each stack so nothing would be misplaced once digging began. Then he knelt on the packed dirt floor and drew the field with a charred stick. Straight rows first, then staggered rows. Finally, the windbreak along the western edge. Each mark carried a measurement. 42 inches between jars, 18 inches below the surface. The neck would sit just beneath a flat stone cap, hidden from the sun and protected from blowing insects. Eliza followed behind him with another piece of charcoal, darkening every row after he checked the spacing again. When one line drifted only a few inches from the pattern, Tobias rubbed it away with his boot and drew it a second time. The field slowly became a network instead of an idea. The jars were no longer cargo on a wagon. They were becoming an underground machine, built one measurement at a time. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eliza looked across the rough map covering the barn floor. What if it fails? Tobias rested the charcoal beside one unfinished row. He did not answer. Instead, he moved 3 jars to a different position, adjusted the spacing between 2 lines, and measured the distance again. Only after the geometry looked right did he quietly extinguish the lantern. Before dawn the next morning, Tobias drove the first shovel into the cold ground. The work settled into a relentless rhythm Dig, measure, lower a jar, pack the soil, check the spacing, cover the opening for the night, then move 42 inches and begin again. The first 3 days passed without surprise. His shoulders stiffened. His palms blistered. Eliza wrapped strips of clean cloth around his hands every evening, brought water to the field, and marked each completed row in the notebook. The fourth morning tested something other than endurance. As Tobias packed the soil around one jar, the wall of the hole suddenly collapsed. Beneath the surface lay an old pocket of decayed roots left from a cottonwood felled years before. The ground shifted. A sharp crack followed. He lifted the broken jar in silence. Late that afternoon, Ephraim Kells rode past, spotted the shattered clay, and grinned. Looks like the ground answered before the sky had to. Tobias never looked up. Instead, he widened the hole, lined the bottom with fine river sand, mixed with sifted wood ash, and rebuilt the support, before lowering a replacement jar from the small reserve Mateo had insisted he keep. Eliza wrote the location in her notebook with one short sentence. Row 4, jar replaced. Tobias turned the broken pieces over in his hands for a moment before setting them aside. One mistake had cost only a single jar. If the same mistake appeared 252 times, it would cost an entire harvest. 11 days after the first shovel broke the ground, the last jar disappeared beneath the soil. Nothing remarkable remained above the surface. Only fresh earth stretched across the field, hiding weeks of labor below. Planting began the next morning. Tobias laid the corn first, placing every kernel where the hidden jars could quietly feed the roots. Pole beans followed beside the stalks they would later climb. Pumpkins filled the open spaces between the rows, their broad leaves destined to shade the soil. Along the western edge, a narrow strip of sorghum waited to break the drying prairie wind before it reached the field. When every seed was covered, Tobias carried the first barrel from the well. He filled each clay jar slowly. The water made almost no sound. It slipped through the narrow neck, disappeared inside, and began moving through the porous walls instead of spreading across the surface where the sun could claim it. Behind him, Eliza covered every opening with a thin piece of slate. Around each stone, she pressed a ring of damp straw mixed with clay, sealing tiny gaps against insects and needless evaporation. By late afternoon, the work was finished. She stepped back and studied the field. It looked ordinary. Nothing suggested that 252 hidden jars now rested beneath the rows, quietly becoming the unseen heart of everything that would grow above them. May arrived quietly, but the rain never truly followed. Each morning, Tobias looked at the sky, then at the field, and trusted neither. He trusted measurements instead. 24 hours after filling the jars, he chose 3 to inspect. One stood among the corn. Another rested where the soil turned sandy. The third lay beside the strip of sorghum facing the western wind. He lowered a dry willow stick into each neck, marked the remaining water with his thumb, and handed the numbers to Eliza. She entered every measurement into the notebook without comment. Then Tobias knelt beside the young plants. The surface felt dry enough to crumble beneath his fingers. He dug only a few inches deeper and squeezed a handful of earth near the roots. It held together. Cool, moist, exactly where the water belonged. Only the eastern corner troubled him. The sandy ground there surrendered its moisture faster than the rest of the field. He marked the row for closer watching, instead of pretending the problem did not exist. That afternoon, Nora Vance happened to pass along the fence. She expected to find Tobias watching the sky like everyone else. Instead, she found him measuring the ground. He opened his hand and showed her the damp soil hidden beneath the dry surface. For the first time, Nora did not know whether to laugh or to ask another question. One calm morning, Eliza stopped beside the jars nearest the fence and frowned. Tiny ants moved between the edges of 2 slate covers. Dry grass seeds had collected around the narrow openings, carried there by the steady prairie wind. She called Tobias over. He lifted one stone and looked inside. The water remained clean, but loose debris had begun gathering around the neck. Left alone, It could slowly work its way downward and interfere with filling the jars through the long summer. He did not argue with what he saw. By noon, the first improvement was underway. A narrow ring of old burlap, lightly dusted with fine wood ash, was tucked beneath every slate cover along the exposed rows. Around each stone, Tobias reshaped the clay and straw seal into a shallow slope. Any rare rainfall could still run toward the opening, but insects and drifting seeds would have a far harder time finding their way inside. Later that afternoon, Ephraim Kells heard about the change and laughed again. "Now you're cooking soup for ants instead of corn." Tobias never answered. He simply finished the last row before sunset. When the work was done, Eliza brushed the dust from her hands and looked across the field. The adjustment had taken only a few hours, yet every jar was better protected than it had been that morning. Tobias smiled for the first time in days. "You probably saved more water today than a small spring rain would have." Eliza looked toward the empty sky. Neither of them expected that rain to arrive. June brought no dramatic warning. The change came a little at a time, which made it easier for most people to ignore. Tobias did not. He stopped judging Willow Creek with his eyes alone. Every third morning, he pressed the same marked cottonwood branch into the stream bed and measured the water against the carved lines. Each reading ended lower than the last. The creek was not failing all at once. It was quietly disappearing. His well still reached the deep aquifer, but every bucket demanded more effort than the one before. The rope stretched tighter. The pulley groaned longer. Water had become weight. Instead of relying on the tall barrel that sloshed with every bump, Tobias rebuilt his hauling sled. He lowered the frame, shortened the runners, and secured 2 smaller barrels close to the ground. Less water spilled. Less strength was wasted before it reached the field. Eliza inspected the well rope each evening, replacing worn strands before they could snap. She patched a slow leak around one barrel hoop with strips of wet rawhide that shrank tight as they dried. Neighbors still worked their own fields. They had stopped making jokes, but they had not yet begun asking questions. The valley was still hoping for rain. Tobias was preparing for the day hope would no longer matter. That evening, Eliza ran her hand along the frayed well rope. She realized that from now on, every bucket drawn from the darkness below carried the weight of far more than water. By the final week of June, the waiting ended. The hot wind arrived. It swept across Red Willow Bench from sunrise until darkness, carrying dust instead of relief. The sky faded into the pale color of old bone. Long cracks opened through the pasture. Even the cottonwoods beside Willow Creek began dropping green leaves long before autumn had earned them. Then July came. Fast. Merciless. By the second week, Willow Creek no longer flowed. Its bed lay exposed beneath the sun. White stones scattered across dry mud that had split into hard plates. The sound of running water disappeared from the valley. The drought had finally spoken. Tobias changed his routine the very same morning. He filled the jars before the first light reached the eastern ridge. He topped them off again after the sun slipped below the western hills. He never poured water at midday, never while the soil burned beneath his boots. He understood what the heat would do. Any water left on the surface belonged to the sky, not the crop. Only water hidden below could belong to the roots. Eliza kept a careful schedule in her notebook, marking every row after its jars had been filled. As she walked the field each afternoon, she searched for curled leaves, pale stalks, or vines beginning to surrender. Every small change mattered now. Across the valley, other farmers began stopping in the middle of their fields. They bent to touch the dust where moist soil should have been. They stared toward the empty creek, then back toward their crops. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody argued about whether rain would come next week. The conversation itself disappeared. Nature had settled the debate without speaking a single word. Several days into July, Tobias found the first sign that even careful planning could miss. The easternmost row of corn no longer matched the rest of the field. Its leaves had not curled, but their deep green had faded to a tired yellow along the edges. The change was slight, Most people would have walked past without seeing it. Tobias stopped immediately. He measured the distance between the two nearest jars and remembered exactly why it was different. While burying them, he had worked around the thick remains of an old cottonwood root. Rather than widening the excavation, he had shifted both jars a few inches farther apart. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now the roots were telling him otherwise. "I cut that corner," he admitted quietly. Eliza brushed her fingers across one yellow leaf without answering. Digging up the entire row would destroy the young roots, so Tobias chose another solution. From the shed, he carried 2 small jars with chipped rims that Mateo had dismissed as unsuitable for deep burial. Tobias buried them halfway between the larger jars, closer to the surface, where they could feed the dry gap directly. Around them, he spread a thick layer of dry prairie grass to slow evaporation and protect the cooler soil beneath. For the next several mornings, Eliza checked that row before any other. The yellow never completely disappeared, but it stopped spreading. The stalks held their height. The leaves remained open through the hottest hours of the day. It was not a perfect victory. It was something better. Proof that careful observation, honest correction, and timely action could still change the outcome after the first mistake had already been made. By mid-July, the drought had stopped making promises. It simply collected what it had come for. Nora Vance's fields surrendered first. Bean vines drooped against their poles. The corn no longer reached for the sky. One warm afternoon, she crossed the road with her young son walking quietly beside her. She wasted no time on polite conversation. "If I buried jars now," she asked, "would they save the field?" Tobias looked across the valley before answering. "They could still save a garden." His voice remained gentle, but not a crop that's already spent weeks searching for water. He explained that the roots had already grown where they could. Digging hundreds of holes now would destroy more than it rescued. The season had moved too far ahead. There was no anger in Nora's face, only the slow weight of understanding. Without another word, Tobias walked into the shed and returned carrying 3 small clay jars with chipped rims. They were unsuitable for deep burial across a large field, but still useful beside a kitchen garden. "Use these for your beans," he said. "Keep them close to the roots." Eliza stepped forward with a small cloth sack. Inside were pumpkin seeds, saved from the previous autumn. "They'll help shade the soil," she said softly. Nora accepted both gifts without speaking. Her son held the jars carefully against his chest all the way home, as though they carried the last remaining chance of rescuing something that the summer had not already claimed. August demanded something different from every previous month. It no longer tested Tobias's ideas. It tested his body. Long before the first hint of daylight, while the stars still hung over Red Willow Bench, he lowered the bucket into the well. The rope hissed through his hands. The pulley groaned. Every barrel had to be filled before the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. The jars never asked for much at one time. They simply asked every day. The blisters on Tobias's palms had burst weeks earlier. New skin formed beneath them, harder than before. Yet every pull on the rope still sent a dull ache into his shoulders. His lower back no longer stopped hurting. It simply became another part of the morning. Before he touched the rope, Eliza wrapped fresh strips of cloth around his hands. Neither of them spoke much anymore. There was too much work for unnecessary words. As the days wore on, she quietly took over several of the lighter trips with the smaller barrels. Tobias protested only once. After that, he simply accepted the help and carried the heavier loads himself. The system was doing exactly what it had been built to do. It was saving water. It was not saving labor. Every one of the 252 jars still had to be filled. Every bucket still had to come from the deep well. Every step still had to be walked beneath a sky that refused to soften. One morning, Eliza tied the cloth around Tobias's hands a little tighter than usual. She pulled the final knot, then held it for a brief moment before letting go. It was the only way she knew to help carry a burden she could never completely lift from him. Late one afternoon near the end of August, Amos Rudd, a 9-year-old ranch boy, wandered along the fence, searching for a stray calf that had slipped through a broken gate. He never found the calf. Instead, he found Tobias's field. The boy stopped without realizing he had stopped. One hand rested on the top rail while his eyes moved slowly across the rows before him. Corn stood shoulder high, its leaves broad and steady, instead of rolled tight against the heat. Pole beans climbed their stalks with dark, healthy vines. Large pumpkin leaves spread across the ground like green blankets, hiding cool soil beneath them. Beyond the fence, the rest of the valley had already surrendered to shades of yellow and gray. Here, summer still looked alive. At the far end of the field, Tobias noticed the boy standing quietly against the fence. He paused only long enough to see where Amos was looking, then returned to checking the jars beneath the next row. He did not wave. He did not explain. Some things no longer needed explaining. From the cabin porch, Eliza watched both of them without interrupting the silence. She understood something Tobias had not yet said aloud. The season had finally produced its first witness. After several long minutes, Amos stepped away from the fence. He turned once more toward the green field, then broke into a run across the dusty road toward home. Tobias remained exactly where he was. He knew the boy would not keep what he had seen to himself. On the frontier, truth traveled from one honest pair of eyes to another long before it ever reached a grown man's pride. Amos never meant to carry news across the valley. He simply told his parents what he had seen. By the following afternoon, the story had traveled farther than any wagon could. Travelers slowed along the road beside the Thornavale claim. Some remained seated on their wagons, others climbed down and stood quietly behind the fence. Dust settled around their boots while their eyes moved across the green rows. No one joked anymore. No one mentioned a pottery graveyard. Ephraim Kells came one evening just before sunset. He stopped at the fence exactly where he had laughed months earlier. This time he said nothing. His eyes followed the healthy corn, then the bean vines, then the pumpkin leaves spreading over dark, cool soil. After a long silence, he removed his hat without seeming to know why. His hands held it awkwardly, searching for something else to do. A short distance away, Silas Breck studied the field with a merchant's eye. He quietly counted rows, estimated bushels, and measured the difference between a full harvest and an empty storehouse. The value of those hidden clay jars was no longer measured in pottery. It was measured in flour, seed, and another winter survived. Tobias noticed the visitors but never stopped working. He lifted another slate cover, checked the water inside, replaced it, and walked to the next row. Nature had already delivered its verdict. The people of Red Willow Bench had simply arrived late enough to witness it. The laughter had disappeared so completely that even the wind seemed unwilling to remember where it had once begun. September arrived with cooler nights and longer shadows. The fierce heat finally loosened its grip, though the sky still offered little rain. Tobias and Eliza harvested the field the same way they had built it, one careful section at a time. The corn came first, then the pole beans. The pumpkins waited until last, their thick vines still protecting the soil they had shaded all summer. Eliza counted every sack before carrying it into the root cellar. She recorded bushels of corn, bundles of dried beans, and each pumpkin lay gently upon clean straw. Nothing entered the cellar without finding its place in the tally book. Tobias kept a different record. He noted which rows had needed the least water, which helper jars had proven worthwhile, which eastern corner would receive another buried jar before the next planting season. The harvest was more than food. It was information. Lessons earned one bucket at a time. Below the cabin, the root cellar slowly filled with the smell of fresh earth, dry corn husks, cured pumpkins, and the quiet promise of winter meals already secured. Outside, the 252 buried jars remained beneath the field, their first season complete. When the final basket had been carried inside, Eliza closed the heavy cellar door and rested one hand against the weathered wood. She stood there without speaking. The room beyond that door held more than grain and vegetables. It held months of labor, thousands of careful decisions, and a future that had once seemed ready to disappear beneath the drought. Before the first autumn frost arrived, Tobias sent a simple message through Silas Breck. anyone who wanted seed, anyone who wanted to learn, anyone willing to work. They would be welcome. 16 families came. Some arrived carrying notebooks. Others brought broken jars they had found in abandoned homesteads. A few simply stood back and watched, still uncertain whether what they had seen all summer could truly be repeated. Tobias never mentioned the laughter. He walked into the field, dug carefully beside one row, and lifted a single clay jar from the earth. Its outer wall remained cool and damp. Fine roots wrapped themselves around the moist soil surrounding the vessel, growing toward the water exactly as he had hoped they would. At that moment, Mateo Cardenas returned to Red Willow Bench with another wagon of pottery. Together, the two men explained every step. How to choose clean river clay. Why fine sand strengthened the walls. Why firing too cool left the jars weak. Why firing too hot sealed the pores. And why no glaze should ever touch the surface. Nearby, Eliza handed small packets of pumpkin and bean seeds to families planning for the next spring. Near the back of the group, Ephraim waited until nearly everyone else had finished asking questions. Then, almost quietly, he spoke. "Would you show me how to fire one correctly?" Tobias reached into a wooden box and picked up a broken piece from the first jar that had cracked beneath the field months before. He placed it in Ephraim's hand. "Start with the mistakes," he said. "They're usually the best teachers." Harvest ended, but Tobias knew the season was not truly finished until the paperwork matched the work. A few days later, he loaded his improvement log, the field survey, and the records of cultivation into his wagon and rode to the county land office. The clerk read every page without hurry, comparing dates, boundaries, and evidence that the claim had been honestly worked. At last, the official seal struck the paper with one firm sound. The 160 acres now belonged to the Thornavale family. When Tobias returned home, the first light frost of autumn had already settled across Red Willow Bench. The corn had been cut. Bean vines had been cleared away. Only short stubble remained where green life had stood through the hardest weeks of summer. Nothing above the ground hinted at what had happened there. Beneath the thin white frost, however, 252 unglazed clay jars still rested quietly below the soil. Some had been lifted, cleaned, and stored for repairs. Most remained where they had spent the season, waiting patiently for another spring. Eliza met Tobias beside the fence before the wagon reached the barn. She never asked how the trip had gone. She saw the folded document resting carefully beneath his hand. That was answer enough. Together they looked across the quiet field. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to prove. Nature had delivered its verdict months before. The law had finally written it down. For the first time since Tobias had noticed the falling creek in early spring, his shoulders slowly lowered, as though an invisible weight had at last been lifted from them. The field stood empty. The wisdom beneath it remained.